The Tinder phenomenon, that's because that's also a major technological revolution, because what it's done, I would say, for the first time, is reduce the cost of rejection to males to zero, because it hides it. The only people you ever hear from are people who haven't rejected you. One of the other things that you want to think about with regards to sex, and I think this is probably particularly true for women, is that to what degree is it in women's interests to allow the cost of sex to fall to zero? Because with pornography certainly does that. And it just seems to me that that's not a very good long-term strategy for relationships between men and women, because whatever sex is worth, the cost of zero is the wrong price.
I've been very curious about apps like Tinder. And I talked to Abigail Schreier about this the other day, because there's some evidence that young people are having much less sex than they were 20 years ago. And so I've wondered with apps like Tinder if what's happening is that a small number of men are getting a tremendous amount of sexual attention from women, and a huge number of men are getting none at all. And the guys that are attractive, say on Tinder, then have their selection. They have women who've already said yes, because that's the only people you communicate with on Tinder, if I understand it correctly. They have all these women at their disposal, essentially, and then almost no incentive, unless they're mature, to have a committed relationship. And so that puts the women in a terrible bind too, because the men that they find attractive are uncatchable in some sense, because the competition level is too high. I don't think that's in anybody's good interest. But I particularly think it's not in the good interest of young women. I also don't think it's in the good interest of young men, because I think it teaches them to be psychopathic predators. Oh, I mean that. I don't see there's any way out of this, because if you repeatedly practice taking sexual intimacy out of the broader context, that's what you're practicing. Well, how is that not? It's shallow, because it's shallow by definition, because it's only the pursuit of hedonistic pleasure decontextualized. You don't know the person, you don't know their story, you're not involved in an ongoing adventure, you're not contributing to one another's lives, you're not dependent on each other, there's no relationship there. So then what is it? So then is it, if you practice interacting with women, but also with men, if you're a woman, as if they're a source of instant context-free gratification, how are you not training yourself to treat human beings as if they're nothing but instant sources of context-free gratification? It's like, what's the proper domain for sexual morality? What are the right rules? Don't do anything with anyone that you couldn't talk to them about. If you feel uncomfortable talking about what you're doing, you don't have a level of psychological intimacy that should allow for that level of physical intimacy, obviously. Also, it's a rule of thumb. I would also say that generally, if you're female and young and attractive, it's in your best interest and in the best interest of the person that you're dating to say no for as long as you possibly can. If for no other reason, then it's without that, well, where's the game? There's no game. And you talked about the chase, and we have no idea how much deprivation proper romance requires. But the answer is definitely not zero, because look, why otherwise? What you meet up with Tinder, let's say, you go to a special room, you both watch pornography, you each have an orgasm, that's your date. Well, why not do that? If that's what it's about, that's simple. There's no mess. Obviously, nobody thinks about that as ideal. And that would be the extreme case of contextless sexual gratification. But it's really wrong. It's wrong. It just doesn't serve anyone. It's terrible. And that's the case with this endless stream of available pornography. It's a catastrophe. Any boy can see more sexual imagery than anyone ever saw in their whole life 30 years ago. It's absolutely appropriate for young women to insist that they be treated the way they would like to be treated. You should insist upon that. Well, your partner should as well insist upon that treatment for him. But so you have to sit down and think about, well, how would you like to be treated? If you could have what you wanted, actually have it. I do believe, though, that that's the case, that no is the right answer most of the time. It's disciplined, that's part of it. It's provocative, that's part of it. It's guarding a secret, it's defending a treasure, it's adding some of the game. And it's a demand that certain preconditions have to be met. And it's the insistence that you be regarded as a complete person. And now, it's going to be tempting to young women too to separate their sexuality and say, well, I can go for instantaneous gratification just like a man. But I do believe that men and women both pay a tremendous price for instantaneous sexual gratification. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But I do believe that women pay a higher price. And the reason for that is that sex is more dangerous for women. And so its capacity to produce catastrophe is heightened in women. Think that sex is okay without romance. You don't know anything about romance, because sex is so much better with romance that it's not even the same thing. So that's all important. But as you get older, what's important is that, well, you have a family, you have your children, you have your grandchildren, you have a continuity of narrative, you have a long-term relationship that you've built. That's what's important. And when you're doing things impulsively when you're young, you're not paying attention to the old you. You have to have the old you in mind. You're going to be old, and you have to be building towards that, or you're going to be old and things are going to be a catastrophe. So this idea that you said, well, I can be just like those men. It's like, well, that isn't even the men you want. Why would you imitate the men that you don't want? I think that by and large women do. If they see that, they do respond to it. But there's a disconnect sometimes. The simple rule breaking isn't differentiated from the sophisticated rule breaking. And so you want to watch that, because that can get you in trouble, right? Because you'll be attracted to the rebel antisocial type because you think he's a rule breaking hero, but he's not. It isn't that he's not a conformist, that he couldn't fit in. That's not the same thing. You want someone who could fit in but breaks the rules. Well, that's back to Hermione. I mean, that's her gift, isn't it? That's her, and the whole Harry Potter crowd, for that matter, is they can fit in. In fact, they're very good at it. They choose when to break the rules.